I broke 2 knuckles on that door the night they crowned me. It seemed the thing to do. I was 26, the circlet was still cold on my head, and my father had been 3 days in the ground. They had walked me down the long stair to the undercroft where the name door stands in its arch of black iron, and Master Ivo Pell had laid my hand flat against the pale plate at its center, and nothing had happened, exactly as nothing had happened for my father, and for his mother before him, and for every soul in the Greelhold going back 90 winters. Ivo had said something gentle. I do not remember what. I remember driving my fist into the door once, twice, hard, and the sound it made, not a boom, not a knell, but a small flat click, like a tongue against teeth. The door of a mountain, and it answered a king's fist with a click. I climbed back up the stair with my hand dripping, and I did not speak to anyone until morning. Here is what is behind that door, or what is supposed to be. The name book, the record of every true name the Greelhold has ever held, and more than the record, the means of it. The way a name is given and rung and set into a child so that the child will always be able to find the way back out of the wolf. That is what a true name is for. It is not decoration. When one of my people takes the wolf, and we all take the wolf, from the highest lord to the girl who scours the fish pots, the wolf is patient and warm and very much older than we are, and it does not care whether you come back. It will carry you 50 miles into the Rack Hills, and it will drink from a stream, and it will lie down in the sun, and it will be perfectly content to lie there for the rest of your life. What brings a man back is his name. Someone stands at the tree line and rings it, and something in the wolf turns its head and thinks, "That is mine, that belongs to me. I had better go and get it." And the man comes walking out of the trees a week later, thin and bewildered, but a man. For 90 winters no child in the Greelhold has been given a name that way. We give them use names. Nell, Oswin, Ivo, Sorrel. Words. You can shout them across a yard and they will fetch a child in from the rain, and they are worth exactly that much and no more. I have lost 11. I keep their use names on a strip of birch above my writing table where the tallies of grain should go. Corvin, who was 19. Ansel, who was a smith and left his forge banked, expecting to be back by supper. Little Hesper Ward, who was 30 and whom nobody had called little in 20 years. 11 in the 14 years of my reign. My father lost 9. His mother lost 16, though the counting was less careful then. They are not dead. That is the part outsiders never understand, and I have stopped trying to explain to envoys who wish to be sympathetic. They are alive out there in the rack, running, well-fed, entirely happy, and they will die of old age without ever once remembering that they had hands. So yes, I broke 2 knuckles on that door, and in 14 years I have done a great deal worse than that to it, and it has never given me anything but that flat little click. Every spring at the thaw we try the lock. It is not a ceremony. I refuse to let it be made into a ceremony, because a ceremony is a thing you have decided to keep doing after you have stopped expecting it to work. It is simply that the thaw comes, and the ford below the hold turns from a road into a brown river, and the whole valley smells of wet iron and green wood and horse, and one morning in that noise I walk down the Undercroft stair with whoever has come, and we try. The year I mean, the year I am telling you about, we tried on the 9th day of the thaw. It rained the whole time, the loud kind, drumming on the leads over our heads. Ivo Pell went first as name-right, because it is his office and his family's disgrace, which is a thing I will come to. He is a small, dry man of 60 with ink on the sides of his fingers, and a way of holding his breath before he touches the plate that I have come to find unbearable, because it is hope, and hope on Ivo's face is like frost on a rose. He laid his palm to the plate. Nothing. He stepped back and wiped his hand on his robe as though it had been wet. Dame Sorrel went next, who runs my kennels and my kitchens, and when I am being stupid, me. Nothing. Then the seer we had paid a great deal of money to bring up from the coast, who had a good voice and told us the lock was sleeping and required to be woken with a certain oil, and who applied the oil, and to whom the lock said click. Then 2 of my lords and Lady Pharaoh's daughter, who is moon-blessed if anyone in this valley is, and who cried afterwards. Then a boy of 11 who had asked to try, and whom I had said yes to. Because the last time we had said no to a boy of 11, it had turned out to be the wrong answer, in a story I do not have room for here. Then me, my hand on the plate. The plate is not cold and it is not warm. It is exactly the temperature of the air always, which no metal is. And if you stand there long enough with your palm on it, you begin to feel that it is not a lock at all but a thing that is waiting politely for you to finish. Click. Well, said Ivo, next year. And I went up the stair and out into the rain and down to the ford, because it was still only the middle of the morning and there was a bell to see to, and I would rather see to a bell than sit in a hall being looked at. The ford bell hangs on a stone post on the near bank, and its whole purpose is to be rung when the water is too high to cross, so that carters coming down the rack road know to turn and take the long way round the shoulder. It had cracked in the last hard frost. It did not ring. It made a noise like a dropped pan. 2 carters had drowned their horses in the 9th day of the thaw before now, and I had put 4 men on the bell already that spring, and had 4 men tell me a cracked bell is a dead bell. There was a woman standing under it. She had a mule and a roll of tools, oiled canvas, tied at both ends, the kind that unrolls into pockets. She had her cloak hood back in the rain, which nobody does, and her head tipped, and her bare hand flat on the stone post below the bell while she struck the bell with the knuckle of the other. She struck it. She waited. She struck it again in a different place. She did not appear to be listening. I came up behind her and said, "It's cracked." She went on striking the bell. "It's cracked," I said again louder, in the voice I use across a yard, and she did not turn, and I put out my hand and touched her shoulder, which I regret, and she came round fast with the little hammer up between us. Not a threat, exactly. The way you turn with a hammer when you have been surprised at the top of a ladder, and looked at my face. Then she looked at the circlet, which I had not taken off, because I am a fool in the rain like other men. She lowered the hammer, and she pointed at her own ear, and she shook her head once. Then she pointed at the bell and made a small hard shape with her hands, twisting, and pointed at the stone post, and then she laid her palm on the post again and struck the bell once more and closed her eyes. I understood the last part at least, though it took me a moment. She was not listening to the bell. She was feeling it come up the stone. I said, "You're a tinker." She watched my mouth. She reached into the breast of her coat and brought out a slate the size of 2 hands, with a stub of chalk on a string, and wrote on it and turned it round. "Founder's daughter. Bells, hinges, locks, mill gear. 2 nights' board and I mend your bell." I have gone over this next part more times than a man should go over anything. I want to be able to say that I was tired, that 11 names on a strip of birch were sitting on my chest, that I had had my hand on the plate an hour before and heard the click. All of that is true, and none of it is the reason. The reason is that I looked at her, a small woman in a wet coat with chalk dust on her fingers and mud to the knee, deaf, alone, standing under a bell that 4 of my own men had told me was dead, and my mind, which is a king's mind and therefore an efficient and worthless instrument, said, "This is not the shape of what I need." What I needed was a scholar out of the coast cities, or a smith of the old blood, or a miracle. What was in front of me was a tinker. I said, "We've no need of a tinker. Try Kettle-Rack down the road. They've a mill." And she read my mouth, and nodded pleasantly, as though I had told her the time, and turned back to the bell. I stood there in the rain for a moment, feeling that something had gone wrong with the conversation, and that it was somehow not her fault, and then I went home. She was still there in the morning. She had a canvas rigged over the bell post out of her mule's blanket and 2 staves. And she was sitting under it, eating bread with the bell taken down, and lying in her lap like a sleeping animal, and she had cut a slot into the crack. Sorrel came and found me watching from the gatehouse, and stood beside me with her arms folded. "That's a stop drill," Sorrel said. "My father did that to a bell in Kettle-Rack. You drill the end of the crack so it can't run on, and then you fill it. She'll be a day at it." I told her we'd no need of her, said Sorrel in the way she has. It's a dead bell. It is, Sorrel agreed. Shall I have someone take her down some soup, or will you go and tell her again? I had the soup taken down. I did not go. Now understand what the Greelhold is in the thaw, because it matters. It is not scenery. The hold sits on an outcrop of black rock above the ford, and everything we have is iron. Iron in the water, iron in the hills, 4 forges going in the lower yard from dark to dark, and the whole place rings. It rings with hammers, and it rings with the bell over the smelt house, and it rings with the 1,100 people who live inside its walls, and none of whom have ever in their lives had to be quiet. In the thaw, the river is so loud under it all that men shout at each other 4 feet apart. It is the loudest place in the world. She worked in it for 3 days. The bell went back up on the second evening, and she rang it, and it rang, not the sound it used to make, a little flatter, a little more like a bell that had been through something. And the carters heard it 2 miles up the Rack Road and turned, and did not drown their horses. I sent down her board money and a small purse besides. She sent the purse back with a boy, and the boy carried her slate down again the next morning to show me what she had written on it. The stone post is loose in its footing. It will drop the bell in 3 years. I can pack it, 2 days. She had drawn beneath a small exact section of the post and its footing with the fault in it in chalk on a slate at the bottom of a hill in the rain. Tell her yes, I said. I did not go down. By the 3rd day was the day of the door. There is a stair from the lower yard that runs down into the undercroft, and the undercroft runs back into the rock, and at the very back of it, past the salt and the winter apples, is the arch of black iron and the name door in it. The door is not iron. Nobody knows what the door is. It is a pale gray-white metal that takes no rust and no polish and no mark, and in the center of it, at the height of a hand, is the plate, a smooth oval a little larger than a palm, with a faint ring of raised beading round the edge and no keyhole. There has never been a keyhole. There is, in a velvet-lined box in my treasury, a key, a great heavy golden thing, 4 hands long, chased with moons and wolves and the crest of the Pells, which has been called the golden key of the Greelhold for as long as anyone can remember, and which was made, if you know what you are looking at, about 140 years ago, by a jeweler for a procession. The door has no keyhole, and we keep a golden key for it in velvet. We have done that for 90 winters. There is nothing I can tell you about my people that is truer than that. She came into the undercroft because the post-packing needed sand, and sand is kept in the undercroft. And she came alone with a hod because she did not know she was supposed to ask anyone. And on her way back out with it, in the dark at the end, she stopped. I have made her tell me this so many times that she has begun to write it out in advance and hand it to me, which I take as I deserve. She stopped because the floor was ringing. Up above, in the lower yard, they had begun the afternoon casting, and the great hammer was going, and the whole rock of the Greelhold was carrying it the way stone does, and she had spent 3 days with her hand on a post learning exactly this valley's particular way of speaking through stone. So she went to the back wall of the undercroft in the dark to feel the hammer more clearly, because she liked it, the way you or I might turn our face to a fire. And the wall was not wall, it was door. And the door was ringing differently from the rock. She set down the hod. She put her right hand flat on the pale metal to feel where the difference was, and she moved it, and she found a smooth oval at the height of a hand, and she laid her palm on it because she wanted to know why it hummed and the rest did not. And the name door of the Greelhold opened 4 inches and stopped. She was, I think, the only person alive in that hold that afternoon who could not hear it. The rest of us heard it. Every soul above ground heard it, over the hammer, over the river, over 1,100 people shouting. A long, low note, one note, that came up out of the rock through the soles of our boots and went on for the length of a slow breath. The forges stopped. A boy in the yard dropped a barrow. Ivo Pell, who was in the scriptorium, later told me that he sat down on the floor. I was on the gatehouse wall. I remember the rain on my face, and I remember the note going through me, and I remember thinking, with a stupidity that I hope I never entirely lose, someone has done it. Someone has done it. Thank God, at last, some great one has come, and I was already running for the yard stair. I came down that undercroft in the dark with 20 people behind me, and I saw the crack of 90-year-old air, cold and dry and smelling of nothing at all, and standing in front of it with her hand still on the plate and a hod of sand at her feet, turning towards the light of our torches with an expression of the most ordinary curiosity, was the tinker I had turned away at my own gate. She looked at us. She looked at the door. She looked back at us, and I want this recorded because the hall has since made her into something with candles round it. She was faintly annoyed. She thought she had broken something. She wrote on the slate, and turned it round, and held it up in the torchlight for the king of the Greelhold and 20 of his people to read. Did I do that? Sorry. I want to tell you that the hall fell to its knees. It did not. What happened was that Ivo Pell arrived at the run and pushed past me, which he has never done before or since, and stopped, and looked at the 4-inch dark and said, "Step aside, girl." She did not hear him. He put his hand on her wrist to move it off the plate. I have to be fair to him. Ivo Pell is a name-right. So was his father and his father's mother, back and back to the 90 winters, and the whole of that office in all that time has consisted of standing in a cellar once a year putting a hand on a plate, and then writing down that nothing happened. He is the keeper of a thing that has not existed since before he was born. He put his hand on her wrist because for one moment, in the dark, with that note still in his bones, he was 11 years old. She let him move her hand. She stepped back. And the door swung shut, not slammed. It drew itself closed the 4 inches it had opened with the unhurried inevitability of a tide and clicked. Ivo put his palm to the plate. Nothing. He put both hands on it. He said the words his family have kept, which I had never heard him say aloud, which are 3 words in a tongue nobody in the valley has spoken in 3 centuries, and which I now know mean, roughly, "Let me in, please." He said them again. He was weeping by then, in the way of men who have not done it for a long time and are not good at it. Nothing. And behind him the tinker, who could not hear a word of it, who had understood only that a small old man was pressing his hands on a door and shaking, reached past him and touched the plate with 2 fingers. The door opened 4 inches. She took her fingers away. It closed. She looked at me, not at Ivo, not at the door, at me over her shoulder with her eyebrows up, and she wrote, one-handed, without looking at the slate. "Do you want it open or not?" We had her in the great hall an hour later, and I made the mistake that everybody makes, which was to fill the room. I put her in a chair by the fire, and I had the lords in and Ivo and Sorrel and both my captains, and 40 more crowded to the walls because it could not be kept quiet and I did not try, and every one of them talked at once. She sat in the chair with her wet boots steaming and looked from mouth to mouth to mouth, patiently, the way you would watch weather. Somebody shouted a question at her from the back of the hall, and then, receiving no answer, shouted it again, louder, and I saw a small muscle move at the corner of her jaw. "Enough," I said. I took a stool and I sat down in front of her, which put my eyes below hers, and the hall did not care for it, and I did not care what the hall cared for. I said slowly, "Nell Quillen, my name is Oswin, will you write for me?" She held up the slate, which had perhaps 40 words worth of surface on it, and looked at it, and looked at me, and I heard the first sound I ever heard her make, which was a short breath through the nose, which I would come to learn was as far as she went in the direction of laughter when the joke was on somebody she did not yet like. Then she wrote, "Get paper." It took us until midnight, and we filled 9 sheets, and this is what was on them. Her name was Nell Quillen. She had been deaf since a fever at 4. Her mother had taught her the hands, a whole language of them, used by the founders' families down the Rack Road who work beside furnaces and cannot hear each other either, and who have therefore been talking with their hands for longer than the Greelhold has stood. She had a sister in Kettle Rack, no husband, no house. She mended bells, hinges, mill gear, and locks. She had been walking the valley since the snow went, and she had come to us because the Ford bell was cracked, and everybody in 3 villages knew it and nobody had done anything about it. I asked her on paper why the door opened for her. She wrote back, because it isn't a lock. I wrote, it is a lock. It has been locked for 90 winters. And Nell Quillen read that and put down her pen, and got up out of the chair in front of the king and the whole hall of the Greelhold, and went and stood by the fire with her back to us for a while, with her arms folded, looking into it. Then she came back and wrote, in a hand that had got worse. It has been answered for 90 winters. There is a difference. You have all been knocking. A lock is a thing that keeps you out until you prove you are allowed. That plate is not asking whether you are allowed. It is asking who is there. Every one of you has put your hand on it and shouted, I am the king, or I am the NAMEWRIGHT, or please. Nobody has stood still and let it feel them. I am not allowed. I am nobody. I did not knock. I said aloud uselessly so that only Sorrel heard it. Then it should have opened for the boy. Nell was watching my mouth. She wrote, what boy? A boy of 11 tried it this spring, I wrote. He wanted nothing. He knocked on nothing. She thought about that for a long moment. And then she wrote the sentence that took the roof off the Greelhold, and she wrote it without any drama at all, in the flat way she writes everything, because to her it was not a revelation but an observation about a piece of machinery. Then it is not only listening for stillness, it is listening for a hand it knows. Whose hands made it? Nobody in that hall could answer her, not the Namewright, not the king, not the 1,100 souls of an iron country hold whose whole wealth and history is the making of things. We knew who had kept the door, the Pells back 90 winters, and before that a line of Namewrights whose records grow thin and then stop. We knew who had opened the door. The Namewrights had once, as a matter of routine, twice a year, at the nomming of the spring children and the autumn children. We knew what was behind it. We knew the shape of the plate and the temperature of it and the sound of the click. We had never once, in 90 winters of despair, asked who had built the thing. Ivo Pell went gray in the face. He stood up in the middle of the hall and he said, there is a record. And then he said, there was a record. And then he sat down again and put his hands over his mouth. I sent for the rolls that night. All of them. Not the fair copies in the scriptorium, the originals, the working rolls of the hold's fabric, out of the deep press where they have been since the flood in my great-grandmother's time, which nobody had opened because the flood had got into them, and everyone knew the flood had got into them. We laid them out on the long tables, and the ink had run, and the mold had eaten the middles out of half of them, and the rats had had the rest. And we worked until it got light with wet cloths and lamps and knives. And at some point in the small hours Nell fell asleep sitting up with her chalk in her hand, and I put my cloak over her, and Sorrel looked at me across the table and did not say anything, which from Sorrel is a speech. We found it a little after dawn. Not a name, a payment, a line in a fabric roll from 300 and some years back in a clerk's hand, an entry between a payment for lead and a payment for lime. To Quillen of the Ford and her house, for the setting of the name door and its plate and the tongues within, in full and final, 40 marks and the freehold of the Ford ground, in perpetuity, and the right of the hand. The right of the hand. I read it 4 times. I read it out to the hall in a voice I did not recognize, and then the whole roll had to be turned over and searched again, and in the margin, where a later clerk had gone through in another century tidying up who owed what, there was a note in a different, meaner ink. Quillen, line failed, removed from the roll, no issue known. Line failed, no issue known. Nobody in the Greelhold had murdered the Quillens. Nobody had cast them out into the snow, or burned an invitation, or sold them to a rival hold. There was no villain and no crime and no scorn worth the name. Some clerk 200 years dead had looked for a quillin in his own street, and had not found one that year, and had drawn a line through them and written no issue known, and gone home to his supper. And the Quillins had gone on down the rack road being founders' people, mending bells, marrying, dying, teaching their daughters the hands and the trade and the feel of iron through stone, entirely unaware that they were extinct. And then the last namewright who had ever known what he was doing died, 90 winters ago, and nobody had a Quillin to send for, because there were no Quillins. It said so on the roll. I found that I had stood up. I found that I was looking at a woman asleep in a chair under my cloak with chalk on her fingers, whom I had told, 3 days before, at my own gate in the rain, that we had no need of her. Sorrel said quietly, "Sit down, Oswin." I said I turned her away. "I know." I told her to try kettle rack. "I know, sit down." I did not sit down. I stood there in the wreck of the rolls with the lamps going out around me, and outside the thaw hammered on the leads, and I did the arithmetic that a king is never allowed not to do. 90 winters, 2 namings a year that never happened. Say 60 children a year in a hold this size, and half of them taking the wolf young, and my father's 9 and my 11, and his mother's 16. And every one of the ones before them running out into the rack hills with nothing to be called back by. The Quillin line had been walking up and down this valley the whole time, mending our bells. I said, "Wake her. Let her sleep. Sorrel. She has been 3 days in the rain packing a post you never paid her for," said Sorrel, "and she is going to want to be awake for whatever comes next. Let her sleep. The door has waited 90 winters. It will wait until breakfast." So we sat, the 4 of us, Sorrel and Ivo and my Captain Bray and me, in a hall full of rotted paper, and we waited for a tinker to wake up, and none of us said very much. Around the 7th hour she stirred, and looked at the cloak, and looked at the room, and read the situation off our 4 faces before anyone had written a word. She sat up, she smoothed the slate on her knee with the heel of her hand. And she wrote well. I turned the fabric roll around and pushed it across the table and put my finger under the line, and I watched her read to Quillin of the Ford and her house and the right of the hand, and then, half an inch away in another century's ink, line failed, no issue known. She read it again. Then she got up and walked out of the hall. She was gone the better part of an hour. Sorrel would not let me follow her. When she came back her face and her hair were wet, and it had stopped raining outside 2 hours before, and she sat down in the chair and picked up the chalk and held it for a while without writing anything. Then she wrote. My mother said we were nobody. She said it as a comfort. She said, "Nobody expects anything of nobody, so you can do good work." She rubbed that out with her thumb before I had finished reading it, and wrote, "What is behind the door?" The name book, I wrote. The names and the giving of them, we think. You think. No one alive has seen it. And Nell Quillin looked at the line in the roll, the setting of the name door and its plate and the tongues within, and something happened in her face that I did not understand for another day and a half, and she stood up and pointed at the floor, meaning down, meaning the undercroft, meaning now. We went down. The whole hall came behind us and I let them, and at the top of the stair I turned round and told them all to be silent, which was the last order I gave in that hold that anyone obeyed for the wrong reason, and they were silent, and 80 people came down that stair without a word, and I do not think one of them understood the joke, that we were being quiet for the benefit of the one person there who could not have heard us if we had come down singing. The torches went up along the walls. The pale door stood in its black arch. Nell put her tools down on the flags and unrolled the canvas and knelt and looked at the plate for a while at close range, and then she did a thing that made Ivo Pell make a small noise. She took out a stub of tallow candle and rubbed it on the beading round the plate's edge, and then wiped it, and held the light close, and read something in the smudge that only she could see. Then she wrote on the slate and passed it up to me without looking round. It is a bell. The plate, it is a tongue plate. It rings and something on the other side hears it and answers. That is all a lock like this ever is. A question and an answer. 90 years of you knocking. It has been trying to be rung. She stood up. She flexed her hand once, the way I have since watched her do 1,000 times before she starts a piece of work, and she laid her palm on the plate, flat, gently, with her fingers relaxed, and stood there in the torchlight with her eyes shut and her head tipped, feeling it come up her arm. The note went through the rock. 80 people took one step backwards altogether, and I did not, because I had my eyes on her face. And the name door of the grillehold swung wide all the way into 90 winters of cold, dry dark. She did not go in. Everyone else moved forward, and she put out her arm across the doorway and stopped them, a tinker, with one arm in a doorway in front of 80 of us, and we stopped, and she stood and looked into that dark for a long moment with a face I could not read at all. Then she took a torch out of Bray's hand and held it out into the room, and I looked past her shoulder, and I saw what my house has been guarding in velvet with a false golden key for 90 winters. Not a book. A rack, floor to ceiling, of iron tongues, hundreds of them, thousands, long thin blades of the pale metal in a wall of them, each one hanging from a peg, each one with a small stamped mark at its head, and every single one of them, from the great ones the length of my arm down to the little ones the size of a child's finger, hung there in silence in the dark, tuned and waiting and unrung. Ivopel said in a whisper, "Where are the names?" And Nell Quillen, who had not seen his mouth move, who could not have heard him if he had shouted, turned round with the torch in her hand, and looked at me with the strangest expression I had ever seen on a human face, not triumph, not wonder, but a kind of grief, the grief of a craftsman who has just understood how a thing broke. And she held up the slate, on which she had already written it, because she had known before the door was open. They were never written down. Your names were never words. Nobody in this hold has been able to read them for 90 winters because there is nothing here to read. They are meant to be felt. Nobody went into that room for 2 days, and it was Nell who kept us out. She would not let a torch across the threshold at first, and when Bray asked why, in the sensible voice of a man who has been up all night, she wrote, "Because I do not know what smoke does to it, and neither do you, and it has been clean for 90 years. So we brought lamps in glass. We brought a bench. She made us take off our boots at the arch, all of us, the king included, which the hall enjoyed a great deal more than I did, and then she went in alone in her stocking feet with her canvas roll under her arm and stood in that cold, dry dark for an hour with her hands behind her back, not touching anything. I stood in the doorway and watched her look. You have to understand what she was looking at. Not a library. A rack of iron tongues on pegs, running back into the rock further than the lamplight went, in rows, and every row was tuned. You could see the tuning if you knew to look for it. The little bevels filed into the tail of each blade, the grooves, the way one tongue was scraped thin near its head, and the next one beside it was left fat. Thousands of small decisions made by hands that had been dust for 3 centuries. And each one hanging silent from its peg, and each one stamped at the head with a mark, not letters. A mark, a little cluster of notches and a curl, no two alike. "Maker's marks," I said when she came out. "Whose?" She shook her head and wrote, "Not maker's marks. Those are on the pegs, not the tongues. See, every peg has the same one. She drew it for me, 3 notches and a curl. That is a Quillen mark. That is my great-grandmother's mother's mother telling you who hung it there." "Then what is the mark on the tongue?" She looked at me a long moment. "It is a way of knowing which is which without ringing it, because if you ring the wrong one you have made a mistake you cannot take back." "Then it's a name." "No," wrote Nell. "It is a label on a name, like the word soup on a jar." Ivopel had come down and was standing behind us with his hands folded into his sleeves. When she showed him that, he made a small strangled sound, and then he said, "The book. There must have been a book, a concordance, a key to the marks." And Nell read his mouth and wrote, quite gently, "There will have been. Where would it be?" Ivopel said, "In the room." We looked in the room. We looked for 2 days. There was no book in the room, and no shelf where a book had been, and no press, and no chest. There was a bench worn hollow at one end. There was a small iron stove with 100-year-old fire in it, cold, undisturbed. There were 3 files, a hammer, a hand vise, and an unfinished tongue in the vise, cut but not yet tuned, and beside it a scrap of paper that had been a note to somebody and was now a shape of dust that came apart when the air moved. And there was the rack. On the 3rd morning, Nell came up out of the undercroft and found me in the lower yard, and she took my sleeve, the first time she ever touched me, and turned me round and put my hand on the wall of the smelt house while the great hammer was going. I felt it, anybody would feel it, the wall shook. She wrote, "What is that?" "The hammer," I wrote. She rubbed it out. "No, what is it? Not what makes it, what is it?" I did not have an answer, and she watched me not have one, and then she took my hand off the wall and put it flat on the top of her own hand where it rested on the stone, so that I felt the wall through her, and she wrote left-handed, badly, one word at a time. "You have all been trying to read them. You looked for a book because you think a name is a word. It is not a word. A word is what you shout across a yard to fetch a child in from the rain. That is what you have all been giving your children for 90 winters, and you have been burying the difference in the hills. A name is what a thing is when it rings." She took her hand away and rubbed the slate on her thigh and wrote one more line, and her writing had gone bad, and I understood that she was frightened, and I understood that she had been frightened since the door opened and had had nobody to be frightened at. I do not know which tongue is whose. Nobody alive does. If I ring the wrong one into a child, I do not know what I have done to it. So do not ask me to. I did not ask her to. I have been given credit since for restraint. There was none. There were 11 use names on a strip of birch above my table, and there were, that spring, 41 children in the Greelhold under the age of 2, and there was a woman standing in my yard telling me she would not gamble with them, and every part of me that was a king wanted to say, "Try it, try one, try it on the smith's boy. We will see," and the only reason I did not say it is that I had already, once in the rain at my own gate, decided that I knew better than Nell Quillen what she was worth. And I had been wrong in a way that had cost this valley 90 winters, and 140 marks of gold spent on a key with no hole to put it in. A man does not get taught that twice. So I said, "Then what will you do?" And Nell wrote, "Work." She worked for 11 weeks. She had the door propped with an iron bar of her own making. She did not trust it, she said, and she was right not to. It closed on Bray's shoulder in the 2nd week, and he wore the bruise all summer. And she had the bench brought out into the undercroft where the light was, and she sat there day after day with a single tongue in the vise, taken down from the rack and hung back exactly, and she felt it. I mean that literally. She would set the tail of it against the bone behind her ear and set her palm flat on the bench, and strike it with a little brass rod and sit perfectly still. Then she would write down what she had felt. She filled 40 sheets. I have them. They say things like heavy, slow to start, 3 beats in the wrist, dies fast and bright, mean, keeps going after you stop wanting it to, and on one page alone, this one is a child. Ivopel sat beside her the whole 11 weeks. That is the thing I did not expect and have never got over. He came down on the 4th morning with his ink and his little traveling desk, and sat down at her elbow, 60 years old, the last of 9 generations of a line whose entire office had just been revealed to have been a man in a cellar putting his hand on a plate for 90 winters and writing down that nothing happened. He could have hated her. He had every reason. His family's disgrace had a face now, and it was a deaf tinker's, and half the hold had already started saying the Pells lost it in the way people say a thing they have wanted to say for a long time. He sat down at her elbow and he wrote on her slate, "Will you teach me the hands?" She taught him the hands. He was slow and his fingers were stiff with ink and age, and he made a sign for iron that she told him meant stubborn, which he took as a fair exchange. By midsummer they were arguing across the bench with their hands so fast that I could not follow, and I would stand in the arch like a boy at the edge of a field, and watch two people talk about the tuning of iron in a language my hold had never bothered to learn from the founders' families who had been talking it under our noses for 300 years. At the end of the 11 weeks, on a hot dead evening in the Undercroft, Nell put down the brass rod and pushed a sheet of paper across the bench at Ivo, and Ivo read it and went white, and Ivo came and found me and could not speak, and led me down. The paper said, "The tongues on the rack are not names waiting for people. They are the names of the people who are dead. This is a graveyard. Every soul this hold has ever named, hanging up in a row in the order they died, and I have been 3 months ringing over your ancestors. The marks are not labels. They are the little notch that says, rung and answered and finished. 90 years back the marks stop. That is where you stop. A name is not chosen off a shelf. It is cut. That is the office. That is what a namewrite was, not a reader, a maker. The child is brought in and the founder cuts a new tongue and tunes it to that child to nothing else to the way that particular small creature rings, and it is struck once into their hand and it is hung on the rack, and it hangs there ringing quietly for the whole of their life whether anybody touches it or not, and when they die it stops and you notch it and it is finished. Nobody read your names, because your names were never anywhere but in the iron and in the children. And the tongue in the vice, the one cut and not tuned, belongs to a child who was born in the spring, the last one of us stopped coming, and who was never named, and who is now 300 years dead, and I have been sitting beside it for 11 weeks. I went into that room again with that paper in my hand, and I looked at the rack going back into the dark, and I understood that I was standing in the middle of every man and woman the Greelhold had ever properly had, and that the last 90 winters of us, my father, his mother, the 16 and the 9 and the 11 myself, the strip of birch above my table, were not on the rack anywhere, and never would be, and had never in any sense that the iron recognized existed at all. Nell was watching my face. She always watched faces. It is where her hearing is. She wrote, "I can cut. I have cut 1,000 things. I have never cut a person. But I can cut." We did not start with the children. I want that written down plainly because the hall tells it wrong. We started with Ansel. Ansel was the smith who banked his forge one afternoon 4 years earlier and walked up the rack road to look at a seam of ore and did not come back, and whose wife Marta had gone on banking that forge every night for 4 years the way you go on setting a place at table. He was, the tallies said, the 5th I lost. He had a use name and no name, and he was alive somewhere north of us with 50 miles of hill in him, and he was, by now, entirely content. I said, "Not a child, me first or one of the lost." Nell wrote, "The lost cannot be there when I cut. That is the whole difficulty. I have to cut a name for a man I have never met and who is not in the room." Then how? She was quiet a while, then she wrote, "Bring me what his hands used." Marta gave us the hammer. She gave it up hard. She stood in the doorway of the forge with it against her chest and looked at me and said, "If this is a thing you are doing to be seen doing, Oswin Greel, I will not forgive you." And I said, "I know," and she gave me the hammer. Nell worked 8 days on that tongue. She would not let anyone in. She had the hammer on the bench and she held the haft where it was worn, and she put the file to the iron and she stopped, and she put her hand back on the haft, and she filed again. On the 4th day she came up into the yard and stood in the middle of the 4 forges going at once with her eyes shut and her hands flat against the smelt house wall for a solid hour. On the 6th she asked Marta what he was like when he was angry. On the 7th she asked what he was like when he was pleased, and Marta said, "He hums," and Nell wrote, "What does he hum?" And Marta said, "Nothing, anything." Badly, and Nell said with her hands, and Ivo spoke it aloud for her, because by then Ivo spoke for her the way a bell speaks for a hammer. Then he is not slow. I have been cutting him too slow. She recut the tale of it that night. On the 9th morning we took it up the Rack Road, 6 of us. Nell, Ivo, Bray, Marta, myself, and Sorrel, who came because she said somebody sensible had to. It was high summer by then, and the road was white with dust, and the hills above us were green and enormous and full of nothing. There is a place where the road tops out and you can see 40 miles of the Rack, fold behind fold behind fold, and it is beautiful, and it is where my people go and do not come back from, and I have not been able to look at it in 14 years. Nell sat up on the crest. She had made a little frame for the tongue, and she hung it, and she looked at Marta, and Marta nodded. She struck it. I heard nothing. I want to be exact. There was no note, no ringing, nothing in the air at all. What there was in the ground, a single small vibration through the soles of my boots and up the bones of my legs, and it was so faint that I would have called it a cart on the road a mile off, and it went on. It did not fade. It kept going, the way the surface of a pond keeps going after the stone. Nell sat down beside the frame with her hand on the post and shut her eyes. Bray said after a while, "Should something." "Be quiet," said Sorrel. We waited on that crest for 2 days. I had bread and a bad blanket and a hill full of nothing, and I sat there and thought about the shape of my own life, which is a thing kings are not encouraged to do, and about a woman a few feet away who had come down the valley to mend a bell and had been told by me personally that she was not needed. On the second evening, Nell put her hand flat on the ground and opened her eyes. Nothing happened for a long time. Then out of the tree line half a mile below the crest, a wolf came. It came slowly, the way they do, stopping, walking on. It was thin and its coat was good, and it stood in the last of the light and looked up the hill at us for a length of time I could not measure. Marta made a sound. Nell caught her wrist and held it. The wolf came up the hill. It stopped 10 feet from the frame, and it looked at the iron tongue hanging there. And then it lay down and put its head on its paws and would not come further. And Nell reached out very slowly and struck the tongue again with the brass rod. And the wolf shivered all over, once, the way a horse does at a fly. And then it stood up and walked to the frame and pressed its head against the hanging tongue, hard, the way a dog leans on your leg, and stayed there. We did not speak. It was Marta who went to it, and she knelt down in the dust of the Rack Road and put her hands into the fur of its neck and said, "Ansel," in the flat voice of a woman who has done this in dreams too many times to trust it, and the wolf breathed and shuddered, and the change came over it the way water changes when it starts to boil, slow and then all at once. And there was a naked, filthy, thin man on the ground with his arms round his wife's waist, 4 years older, weeping and saying, over and over, a word that was not any word, that was a sound, that was the sound of the tongue. He would not let go of Nell's hand for an hour afterwards. He did not know her. He held on to her hand and said, "I could hear it in the ground. I could hear it in the ground." And Nell watched his mouth and nodded and did not tell him, then or ever, that she could not hear it either. I got 7 of the 11 back. I want to be honest about that, because the hall has made a song of this, and the song says 11. 7, Ansel first, then Hesper Ward, who was found asleep against the frame in the morning and who is now 60 and terrifying and runs my second forge. Then a girl called Wren, then the 2 Ostel brothers together, who came out of the trees side by side and have never once been able to explain that. Then Corvin's cousin Ants. Corvin did not come. Nell cut him twice. She sat on that crest for 4 days the second time. We took his mother and his knife and the little wooden dog he had made as a boy, and on the 4th night Nell struck the tongue and struck it and then stopped and put both her hands over her face for a moment, and then wrote with her hands shaking so that Ivo had to read it twice. "He is too far, or he is dead, or he is happy. I cannot make it be otherwise by hitting it harder. I am sorry, I am so sorry, I am not enough." And I took the slate out of her hands and I threw it off the crest into the rack, which was the wrong thing to do, and then I knelt down in the road in front of her, and I made the sign that Ivo had taught me a fortnight before, the only one I had truly learned, both hands, palm up, the founder's sign that means my fault, mine, put it here. And Nell Quillen looked at a king kneeling in the dust of the rack road, holding out both hands for a grief that was not his to take, and she began to laugh, and then she stopped laughing, and she put her hands into mine. We came down with 3 tongues uncut, and 4 names we would never have. The strip of birch is still above my table. Corvin, Kestrel, Ide, and a girl called Tamsin Pharaoh who went into the hills the winter before I was crowned. I do not take it down. Ivo asked me once whether I would like the 4 of them entered in the new rolls as lost properly with the ceremony, and I said no, and could not tell him why, and Nell told him later in the hands when she thought I was not watching, because a strip of birch above a table is where you put a thing you have not finished being ashamed of. She was right, of course. She usually is, and she says it in about 9 words, which is the great advantage of a language you make with your hands. You do not waste it. The nomming of the children began in the autumn. 41 of them under 2, and the older ones, because it turned out, and Nell had suspected it, that a name can be cut for a body of any age, and the Greelhold that year had 1,100 souls in it, and not one of them had ever been named. She cut them one at a time, never more than 2 in a day. It takes what it takes. She must have the person in the room and their hands on the bench and quiet, real quiet, which in the Greelhold meant stopping the forges, which meant that from that autumn to this day the 4 forges of the lower yard shut down for an hour at noon, every day, and 1,100 people go quiet, and nobody in this valley thinks it strange, and travelers think we are a very pious sort of hold. We are not pious, we are being cut. Ivo Pell held the record, the real one at last, the one that says this mark, this notch, this child, this day, and it is his hand in the new roll, all of it, 9 generations of Pells vindicated by a man who spent his 61st year learning to talk with his fingers. He is dead now, 11 years. His mark is on the rack. Nell cut it. When she rang it into his hand, he sat there with his eyes shut, and then he wrote on her slate, "Oh, is that me? Is that what I've been?" And he laughed until he cried, and I was standing in the arch, and it is the finest hour of my life. Now I have to tell the part. I have been walking around. I had by then given her the Ford ground. That was not romance. That was law, and I did it in the ugliest and most public way I could find, because a thing done quietly can be undone quietly. I stood up in the hall in the harvest month and had the fabric roll brought in with the flood stain on it, and I read out to Quillen of the Ford and her house in full and final, 40 marks in the freehold of the Ford ground in perpetuity and the right of the hand, and then I read out in the same voice, Quillen, line failed, removed from the roll. No issue known. And I said, the Greelhold has not been cursed, the Greelhold has been sloppy. They did not like that, good. I gave her the Ford ground and the 40 marks, and I gave her the right of the hand, restored in perpetuity to her and hers, and I had the clerk's line struck out, and the striking out witnessed by every lord I had. And then I did the only clever thing I have ever done in that hall, which was to say nothing at all about what I owed her personally, because I had begun to understand that if I once said it aloud in front of 1,100 people, she would have to be gracious about it. And I did not want her gracious. I wanted her exactly as she had been on the 9th day of the thaw, with a hammer up between us, unimpressed. The golden key I left where it was in its velvet in the treasury. Sorrow wanted it melted. Nell, when I asked her, thought about it for a while and then wrote, "No, keep it where you can see it." Why? Because it is very beautiful and it does not fit anything, and you spent 140 marks on it, and every man in this hold walked past it twice a day for 100 years and thought, well, we have the key. She looked up at me and added underneath, "You are going to want reminding." I said, "Marry me," about a month after that, standing in the Undercroft with iron filings on my sleeve and no plan whatsoever. I have to defend myself here, a little because of what everyone believes about my kind. There was no bond. There had been no bond from the first day to that one. I had waited for it, of course I had. I am a wolf and a king, and I have been raised on the certainty that when the right woman stands in front of you, something in you knows before you do, and you are spared the labor of deciding. Nothing had ever come. Not on the Ford bank, not in the torchlight, not on the crest of the Rack Road with her hands in mine. Nothing, ever, and I had lain awake over it for months like a man with a stone in his boot, until one evening in the summer I had understood that I was waiting for a bond to tell me a thing I had known since I watched her stop 80 people with one arm across a doorway, and that if I waited for it, I was no better than a man who cannot decide his own supper. So there was no bond. There was only me in a cellar with filings on my sleeve saying it wrong. She looked at me for what felt like a season. Then she wrote and passed it over. Say it again where I can see your whole face. I said it again. She wrote, I have been mendied by nobody, Oswin. I am not a thing you found. I was walking down this road before I ever heard of your door, and I would have gone on walking down it. Yes, I wrote, I know. Do you? You told me so with a hammer in your hand on the first morning. And Nell Quillen put her forehead down on the bench for a moment, on her folded arms, on top of 11 weeks of paper, and when she lifted it up she wrote, in her own particular ruinous hand. Then yes, but not because you are a king. Because you knelt in a road for a man you never found. We were married in the winter in the hall badly, with everybody's hands going at once and half the hold trying to make the sign for joy and making the sign for bread, which Nell says is the same thing if you are hungry enough. And it was not until the spring after, on the 9th day of the thaw, that she cut mine. I had put it off. 1,100 people had been named, the Smiths and the Salters and the Kennel Girls, the Lords, the Bobbies, Sorrel who wept, which nobody had ever seen and nobody has ever mentioned to her since. Ivo, the boy of 11 who had asked to try the plate, and the king had not been named, and everyone in the hold knew it and nobody said it. It was not modesty, it was fright. I had watched 1,100 people sit at that bench and take a note into their hand and go white or laugh or weep, or, in the case of a very old salter called Braw, say quietly, "Ah, I knew that," and go back to work. And I had understood, watching them, that a name is not a gift. It is a verdict. It is what you are when you ring, and there is nothing you can do about what you are. And for 14 years I had been a man who could not open a door, who lost 11, who turned a woman away at a gate in the rain because she was not the shape of what he needed. I did not want to hear it. Nell knew. In the way she knows things. On the 9th day of the thaw she came and stood in the door of my chamber with the frame under her arm and the brass rod in her belt, and she did not write anything. She just stood there. I went down. She had already cut it. That was the thing that undid me before we began. She had had my name in her hand for I do not know how long and had not told me. She had it in the vise and it was small. It was a small tongue. I had expected, God help me, I had expected the great one, the arm's length one, the king's one, and it was a hand's breadth of pale iron with a long thin tail and a fat body, scraped almost through in one place near the head so that the light came round it. She put my hand on the bench. She put her own hand over mine. She struck it. I have to try to say this properly, because everything my people say about the bond is wrong, or it is right for them and it was wrong for me, and I have had 30 years to find the words. There was no note. There was never going to be a note. I know that now. There is never a note for anyone. The note is a thing the rock does afterwards. What there was in the bone of my hand and the bone of my arm and then in the whole floor of me. A low, slow, patient, unhurried thing, going on, not stopping, and it was not beautiful and it was not grand. And I recognized it, absolutely and instantly and with a kind of horror, the way you recognize your own voice coming back at you off a wall. It was the wall of the smelt house under my palm. It was the Ford bell coming up a stone post. It was 2 days on a crest in the Rack with nothing in the air. It was the sound the door had made, not the great note that 80 people heard, but the other one underneath, the one that only somebody with her hand flat on the metal would ever feel. I had spent my whole life listening, and the only thing that has ever spoken to me spoke in the ground. And I turned my hand over under hers and held on, and my wolf, which has been loud in me since I was 9 years old, which has never once been quiet in a crowded hall, which stands up in me when I am angry and paces when I am bored. My wolf folded its legs down like a dog that has come in off the road, and put its chin on the floor of me and stayed. Nell was watching my face. She was, I saw, quite pale. She let go of the rod and wrote on the bench in filings with one finger, "What is it?" I could not write. I took her hand and put it flat on the bench over the base of the frame, where the tongue was still going, and I laid my own over the top of it, and I let her feel my name. She sat very still. And then she began to cry without any noise, the way she does everything, and she pulled her hand out from under mine and wrote on the slate, fast, and the chalk broke, and she wrote with the stub. "It is the same. Oswin, it is my hands. It is what my hands feel like from the inside. I have been listening to that since I was 4 years old, and I thought it was the world." And I said aloud uselessly, to a woman who could not hear me, in a cellar at the age of 40. "I know, I've been in the room the whole time. They tell it in the hall as the bond. I let them. It is easier than the truth, which is that I chose her in a cellar with filings on my sleeve months before, with nothing to help me, and that the iron only agreed with me afterwards, which is what iron is for. 90 winters, we kept a golden key in velvet for a door with no hole in it. 90 winters the namewrights of this hold put their hands on a plate and shouted their titles at it. And the whole time the thing was doing what it was made to do, which was to sit in the dark and listen for a hand that knew how to be quiet. And there was not one of us in 1100 who had ever been quiet in his life. And the woman who was born quiet was mending our bells for 300 years, and we had crossed her name out of the roll because a clerk could not find her in his own street. I turned her away at my gate. Let that be in the record with the rest. Nell is 59 now. Her hands have gone bad in the last 2 winters. The trade does it, the file and the cold, and she has 3 apprentices, and one of them is our daughter, and the second is Marta's granddaughter, and the third is a boy from Kettlerack who came up the road one spring with a mule and no letter and no introduction, and stood at the gate in the rain. They did not turn him away. They cannot. It is the only law I have made in 30 years that I am certain of, and it is not written in any roll but the fabric one, between a payment for lead and a payment for lime, where it belongs. No one who comes to this gate is told to try Kettlerack. The forges still stop at noon. The rack goes further back into the rock every year, and there are notches on the near end now, Ivo's among them, and my father's, cut late, which Nell did for me one evening without being asked, and which I did not find out about for a year. And on the 9th day of the thaw, every year, when the ford is a brown river and the whole valley smells of wet iron, I walk down out of the hold on my own, and I stand on the near bank under the bell. She comes down after a while. She always knows. She puts her hand flat on the stone post, and I put mine over it, and I reach up and strike the bell badly off the sweet spot, the way I did the first time, because it makes the post shiver in a way she likes, and my wife, who has never heard a bell in her life, tips her head and shuts her eyes and holds up 2 fingers, meaning, again, lower.